Frances Prescott had learned early in life that a woman's name was little more than a tag stitched to luggage, something useful so the next pair of hands would know which bag they were carrying. She was born in the autumn of 1871 in a small Missouri River town called Carver's Crossing, a place that smelled of catfish and wet lumber and the perpetual disappointment of men who had wanted something better out of the frontier. Her mother, Clara Prescott, had died 3 days after Frances came into the world, leaving behind nothing but a name written in faded ink on a church ledger, and a daughter with eyes the color of deep river water, that particular blue-green that looks gray in shadow and startlingly bright in sun. Her father, Thomas Prescott, was a fur trader by occupation and a drunk by vocation, and he had looked at the infant girl with an expression that was not cruel but was, perhaps worse, entirely blank, as if he had been handed something in a language he did not speak. Thomas Prescott kept Frances until she was 6 years old. He fed her mostly. He kept a roof over her mostly. He did not strike her, which she later understood was a grace she had not recognized at the time because she had nothing to compare it against. Then one November, when the river froze early and the trading season went to ruin, Thomas Prescott rode south with 2 other men to look for work in the Arkansas Territory, and he left Frances at the door of his older brother Harold with a single carpetbag, a note that said she was a good girl and ate nearly nothing, and the promise that he would return in the spring. He never did. Frances spent years, quiet years, wondering if he had died or simply decided that spring was too much trouble. Harold Prescott was a God-fearing man who said so frequently enough that it functioned as both introduction and warning. He owned a dry goods store in a town called Millhaven, Missouri, and he had a wife named Ruth who was thin and tired-eyed, and who looked at Frances not with malice, but with the weary arithmetic of a woman already stretched too thin. Harold decided that Frances would help in the store. She swept floors and counted inventory and wrapped parcels in brown paper, and she learned to be very still and very quiet because Harold believed that children who were still and quiet were the ones closest to God, and Frances figured that being close to God was probably safer than the alternative. She stayed with Harold until she was 14. She learned to read properly because Ruth, despite everything, believed in reading, and she pressed second-hand books into Frances's hands with a furtive generosity that felt almost like tenderness. Frances devoured them. Histories, novels, almanacs, seed catalogs, anything with words on a page became a kind of door she could open and walk through, leaving Millhaven and Harold and the smell of sackcloth entirely behind. But when Frances was 14, Harold's business failed, and he made arrangements with a neighboring family, the Wentworths, who needed help with their 5 children and their farm outside of town. The Wentworths were not unkind. That was the precise, honest way to say it, not unkind, which is a very different thing from kind. Frances cooked and cleaned and mended and minded the children and rose before dawn every morning of every season, and in exchange she had a bed in the room above the kitchen and 3 meals a day, and the understanding, spoken and unspoken, that this was the best a girl in her position could reasonably hope for. She was not their daughter. She was not their servant exactly, though the distinction grew thinner with each passing year. She was something without a clean category, a girl borrowed and never quite returned. At 19, a man came to buy horses from Chester Wentworth. His name was Gerald Alderman, and he was 31 years old, and he was not unhandsome in a broad, weathered way, with a cattleman's tan and clean boots that told you he was doing reasonably well. He looked at Frances across the yard and spoke to Chester Wentworth about her as if she were one of the horses, which was perhaps an uncharitable way to think of it, but Frances found that it was also accurate. Within a month, arrangements had been made. Frances was to be married to Gerald Alderman, who had a cattle operation down in the territory of New Mexico, a place called Dry Wash Flats that sounded to Frances like somewhere water had given up and left. She married Gerald Alderman on a Thursday in March of 1891, because Thursday was the day the circuit preacher came through, and Friday was market day, and Chester Wentworth was busy on Fridays. She wore a dress that Ruth Prescott had mailed to her, a dove-gray dress with pearl buttons that Ruth had clearly spent more than she should have on, and Frances stood in front of the preacher, and said the words, and felt the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who are making decisions about your life without ever once looking you in the eye and asking what you thought about any of it. Gerald Alderman was not a bad man. She told herself this frequently in the 2 years that followed, the way you repeat a thing to make it hold. He did not raise a hand to her. He was not given to cruelty or even particular coldness. But he was indifferent in a way that wore on her like wind on sandstone, not violent, just constant. He spoke to her about cattle prices and rainfall measurements and fence line disputes with the same flat tone he used for everything else, and when he touched her, it was with the brisk efficiency of a man with other things on his mind. She was a fixture of the house, useful and expected, like the iron stove or the water pump. She kept the books because she was good with numbers. She mended his shirts. She planted a kitchen garden that nobody asked her to plant because she needed something to be hers, some small insistence that she existed with preferences and the ability to act on them. Then Gerald Alderman died of a rattlesnake bite in June of 1893, 3 days after the snake got him in the right calf while he was checking fence line on the eastern pasture. He died slowly and with considerable suffering, which Frances did not enjoy witnessing, despite everything. She sat with him. She did what the doctor in town instructed. She held his hand in the last hours when he had ceased to make sense and was calling out for his mother, and she felt sorry for him in a clear, uncomplicated way that surprised her, because she had not known she had that much generosity left. After Gerald was in the ground, his older brother Clement arrived from Texas within 3 weeks. Clement Alderman was cut from a harder cloth than Gerald, a sharp-eyed man of 45 who wore his suspicion of women openly, and who went through the account books with the focused energy of someone expecting to find something wrong. Frances had, in fact, kept impeccable records. Clement found nothing to quarrel with on paper, which seemed to frustrate him. He informed Frances that the cattle operation would be absorbed by the main Alderman holdings in Texas, and that the house and land would be sold, since Gerald had left no will that anyone could locate, and that Frances, as a woman without children and without independent means, would of course require new arrangements. Frances sat across from Clement Alderman at the table she had set every morning for 2 years, in the kitchen she had scrubbed every week, in the house she had made livable through plain hard work, and she felt something shift inside her. It was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. It was something older and more fundamental, the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been handed from one set of arrangements to another for the entirety of her 21 years, and had never once been consulted about any of it. She had some money saved. Not much. Gerald had not been generous with household funds, and Frances had been careful, buying less than she was given allowance for, and setting the difference aside in a tin box beneath the floorboard under the kitchen table. $43 and some cents. In the late summer of 1893, that was not nothing, but it was not freedom either. It was a start. Clement Alderman had already made inquiries on her behalf, he informed her. A family in the town of Harlan, New Mexico Territory, needed a housekeeper. They were good people, he said, respectable. She would be treated well. Frances looked at Clement Alderman for a long moment. He was already gathering up the papers on the table, already moving on to the next thing, the way men like him always did, efficiently and without particular interest in the response of the person being managed. "No," she said. Clement looked up. He had the expression of a man who had heard the word but did not believe it had been spoken in earnest. "I beg your pardon." "No," Frances said again, and her voice was level and quiet and entirely certain. "I will not be going to Harlan." "I will make my own arrangements, Mr. Alderman. Thank you for the concern." She left Dry Wash Flats 2 days later, before Clement could construct an argument that she did not have the social armor to deflect. She took her clothing, her books, her $43, and the small leather-bound journal she had kept since Ruth Prescott had given her one for Christmas when she was 12. She took the morning stage north toward the town of Redemption Falls, which she had heard mentioned by a traveling merchant 2 winters before as a growing place, a real town with a hotel and a church and a newspaper, which seemed to her like evidence of civilization. The stage let her off at the edge of Redemption Falls on a Thursday afternoon in late August of 1893, and Frances Prescott stood in the main street of a town she had never seen and felt, for the first time in her memory, the specific terror of having no one to be handed to. She also felt, beneath that terror, something that took her a moment to name. It was, she finally understood, possibility, thin and fragile as early ice but real. Redemption Falls, New Mexico Territory, was a town of perhaps 400 souls in the summer of 1893, growing fast on the strength of cattle ranching and the silver deposits in the hills to the northeast, and growing the complicated way that western towns grew, with more ambition than infrastructure and more men than sense. There was a main street of packed dirt that ran east to west, and on it sat the Grand Hotel, which was neither grand nor a hotel in any formal sense, but which had 12 rooms and a dining room that served beef stew every day of the week. There was a general store run by a man named Horace Beale and his wife Dolers, a livery stable, a law office, a barber shop, a saloon called the Crossed Spur, and a small clapboard church that the Reverend Aldridge filled on Sundays with equal parts scripture and improvised theology. Frances went to the Grand Hotel first and inquired about a room. The proprietress was a woman named Mabel Garrett, a compact, decisive woman in her 50s who had been running the hotel since her husband Jerome fell off the water tower in 1886 and had, in Frances's estimation, been doing a considerably better job of it. Mabel looked Frances over with the quick, assessing gaze of a woman who had seen most varieties of human trouble walk through her door and had learned to categorize them efficiently. "You looking for work?" Mabel asked. "Yes," Frances said. "I'm good with figures and with cooking, and I can manage a household. I'm also a fair hand at mending, and I read and write well." "Can you manage difficult people?" Frances thought of Harold Prescott and Clement Alderman. "Yes," she said. "I believe I can." Mabel Garrett hired her on the spot to help manage the hotel, keeping the accounts, managing the rooms, helping in the dining room during the busy hours. In exchange, Frances got a small room at the end of the upper hallway, meals, and a modest wage. It was not glamorous. The room was barely wide enough for the narrow bed and the small dresser, and in August the heat was punishing and the guests were frequently loud and occasionally troublesome. But the room was hers. She had a key. She locked it at night and lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the town and felt something she had never quite felt before in any room. She'd slept in the satisfaction of knowing that nothing in this room, not even her presence in it, had been arranged by someone else. She had been in Redemption Falls for 3 weeks when she first noticed Roy Ralston. She noticed him the way you notice a storm coming in over the high plains, not all at once, but in stages. First the quality of the light changes, then the air shifts, and by the time you can see the dark line on the horizon you've already felt it in your bones. He came in on a Tuesday evening for supper in the dining room, a tall man in a weathered canvas duster the color of dry grass, with trail dust on his hat, and a straight-backed way of moving that was not stiff but was deliberate, like a man who had decided long ago that he was going to move through the world with intention and had kept to that decision. He was, Frances estimated, somewhere close to 30, maybe a year or 2 to either side, with a jaw that needed a razor and dark eyes that moved across the room with the unhurried attentiveness of someone who was genuinely curious about what they saw rather than just cataloging threats. He sat at the table by the window, took his hat off and set it on the empty chair across from him, and when Frances brought out the stew, he thanked her in a voice that was quiet and meant it. She did not think much of him beyond noting that he was polite and that his hands, when he took the bowl, were the hands of a man who worked hard and knew it. He came back the next evening, and the one after that. On the fourth evening, Mabel Garrett mentioned at breakfast that Roy Ralston was a rancher, had a spread of about 3,000 acres some 12 miles northeast of town, at the foot of the Silver Hills, where he ran cattle and a few horses. He'd been in Redemption Falls for 2 years, Mabel said, having come down from Colorado Territory. He was known to be a square dealer and a man who paid his debts on time and did not start trouble, though he was generally understood to be capable of finishing it if someone else started it. He was, Mabel added with a particular tone that Frances had learned meant Mabel considered the following fact relevant and intended Frances to absorb it, unmarried. Frances absorbed this fact and set it aside in the orderly mental cabinet, where she put things that were interesting but not immediately her concern. What became her concern, and quite quickly, was that Redemption Falls had a problem. The problem arrived in the person of a man named Dalton Voss, who rolled into town in September of 1893 with 6 men, and a reputation that preceded him by several hundred miles. Voss was a land speculator and a bully of the legal variety, the kind of man who had learned that the fastest way to acquire property in the New Mexico Territory was to find a claim or title with any vulnerability whatsoever and press on it with lawyers and money, and the implied threat of the harder men he kept around him. He had his eye on several of the smaller ranches and homestead claims northeast of Redemption Falls, and he had set up an office in the building next to the law office, with the stated intention of conducting legitimate business and the actual intention of making life difficult until people sold low. Frances encountered Voss on her 3rd day of his occupation of the town, in the dining room of the Grand Hotel. He sat with 2 of his men and spoke loudly about the interior decoration and the quality of the stew and the general inadequacy of frontier hospitality. And when Frances brought the coffee, he looked at her with the particular variety of gaze she had learned to recognize and detest, the gaze of a man assessing something for purchase. "You run this establishment?" he asked. "I work here," she said. "Shame," he said. "A handsome woman ought to have more to show for herself than an apron." Frances set the coffee pot down, refilled his cup without spilling a drop, and said, "I'll let Mrs. Garrett know you found the service satisfactory," and walked away at the pace of someone who has nowhere to hurry to and no interest in looking hurried, which was a skill she had perfected over years of working for people who enjoyed the feeling of being obeyed. She told Mabel about Voss's presence in the dining room and what he had said, not because she was alarmed, but because she believed Mabel had a right to know what variety of man was sitting at her tables. Mabel's expression went flat and unreadable in the way it did when she was organizing something internally. "Keep an eye on him," Mabel said, "and tell me anything you hear." Frances kept her ears open, which was something she had always been good at. People spoke freely around women who appeared to be merely going about their work. She heard things in the dining room and at the front desk and in the hallways of the Grand Hotel that assembled themselves, piece by piece, into a picture. Voss was targeting Roy Ralston's ranch specifically. It was the largest of the operations in the Northeast Corridor, and Voss had found what he believed was a weakness in the land patent that had been filed when the original homestead claim was established. She heard this on a Friday evening from 2 of Voss's men who were eating supper 2 tables apart from Roy Ralston, who was working through his stew in characteristic quiet while reading something folded in his coat pocket. She did not know if Roy Ralston was aware that the men at the table near the wall were discussing his land title with the casual confidence of men who believe the person they're discussing can't hear them. She suspected Roy Ralston was more aware of his surroundings than most people gave him credit for, but she was not certain. When Roy Ralston stood to leave, Frances happened to be clearing the table beside the door, and he nodded to her the way he always did, and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear it, "Those two men near the wall, they work for Dalton Voss. You might want to know what they were saying." Roy Ralston stopped. He looked at her with those dark, attentive eyes, and the quality of his attention was different from most. It was the attention of someone who was genuinely listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. "I'd be grateful if you'd tell me," he said. "Walk past the hotel window in 10 minutes, she said. "I'll be sweeping the porch." She was sweeping the porch when he came by, and she told him what she had heard in clear and precise language while continuing to sweep. He listened without interrupting, which was a quality she noticed because it was not common. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You're careful." "I try to be," she said. "Thank you, Miss Prescott," she said. "Frances Prescott." "Roy Ralston," he said, though she already knew. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm in your debt, Miss Prescott." "You're not," she said. "Dalton Voss is an unpleasant man, and I have no interest in seeing him succeed at anything." He almost smiled. She saw it at the corners of his eyes before it got to his mouth. "Nevertheless," he said, and walked on into the evening. She watched him go and then went back to sweeping and told herself that Roy Ralston was simply a rancher, and she was simply a hotel worker, and that this was an entirely ordinary exchange in an ordinary Western town, and nothing more than that. She was not entirely convinced of her own argument. Roy Ralston came to the hotel the next morning and asked Mabel Garrett if he might speak with Miss Prescott on a matter of business, which was the appropriate thing to say and the right way to say it. Mabel sent Frances to the small sitting room off the lobby with a look that could have meant several things, and probably meant all of them. Roy sat in the chair across the small table from her with his hat in his hands, and told her that the information she had provided the previous evening had confirmed something he had been beginning to suspect, and that he needed to ride to the county seat to see a land attorney about his patent filing, and he expected to be back within a week. He wanted her to know he was leaving, he said. And why? Because she had put herself in a position of some risk by speaking to him, and he thought she deserved to know that her information had been useful and would be acted on. Frances looked at him across the table and felt something shift again, the same kind of shift she had felt in Clement Alderman's kitchen, but different in character entirely. Then it had been the shock of her own refusal. This was something else, the unexpected, slightly disorienting experience of a man speaking to her as if her understanding of the situation was a thing that mattered. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "Are you all right here?" he asked. "With Voss in town, has he given you trouble?" "He is unpleasant," she said. "I can manage unpleasant." "I don't doubt that," he said with that same near smile. Then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, "Would you mind if I called on you when I return, to let you know how it went?" Frances considered the question. The honest answer was that she would not mind at all, and that this was already something she needed to think carefully about, because she had learned that wanting things was a complicated enterprise for a woman in her position. "Yes," she said, "I think that would be fine." He left for the county seat that afternoon. She watched from the hotel window as he rode out heading east on a gray horse, and the watching was something she admitted to herself quietly and without particular alarm. With Voss in town and Roy Ralston gone, Redemption Falls entered an uncomfortable week. Voss's men were loud in the crossed spur most evenings, and inclined to the kind of behavior that stopped just short of something the town marshal, a careful man named Clifton Reese, could formally act on. Voss himself continued to eat in the Grand Hotel's dining room, where he seemed to have decided that Frances was an entertaining obstacle. He made remarks that were pointed enough to be offensive and vague enough to be deniable. Frances responded to all of them with the same pleasant, impenetrable efficiency that she had developed over years of managing impossible situations with limited power, and she did not let him see that any of it landed. But it did land, a little, in the private hours of the evening when she was alone in her narrow room with her journal and the sounds of the town outside her window. She wrote in the journal honestly, which was the only way she had ever been able to write in it. And what she wrote was that she was tired of men who moved through the world as if women were furniture, and that she was grateful for her $43 and her small room with its key, and that she was also, unexpectedly, looking forward to the return of Roy Ralston, which was interesting and possibly alarming, and she was not entirely sure what to do about it. She had spent the better part of 22 years not doing anything about the things she wanted, because the space for wanting and acting on it had never quite existed. She thought about this a lot that week, in the way you think about a door you have never walked through, wondering what the room on the other side looks like and whether the floor is solid. Roy Ralston came back on a Saturday, 7 days after he had left, and he came straight to the hotel before he even went to the livery, which Frances thought said something about him. She was behind the front desk when he pushed through the door, still travel-worn, and his face, when he saw her, had the particular quality of someone who had been thinking about the person they were looking at. "The patent holds," he said. The attorney found the issue. It was a notation error in the original survey, nothing that affects the validity of the title. He's filing the correction papers with the Territorial Land Office. Voss won't have anything to stand on. "I'm glad," Frances said, and meant it with a directness that surprised even herself. He told her the details, standing at the front desk while she listened, and then he asked if she would take supper with him that evening, and she said yes. They sat at the table by the window, the one where he always sat, and they talked for 2 hours. This was the conversation that Frances would think back on for years, because it was the first conversation she had ever had with a man that felt genuinely reciprocal. Not a report given to a superior, and not the kind of hollow small talk you performed in dining rooms to make the time pass, but an actual exchange between two people who were curious about each other and who were both, she realized, somewhat surprised to find themselves feeling that way. She told him about Missouri, which she almost never mentioned. Not in the self-pitying way she had occasionally heard other women speak of difficult pasts, but plainly, the way you state facts. Her mother had died, her father had left. She had lived with Harold and then with the Wentworths and then been married to Gerald Alderman and then had come here. He listened to all of it without either false sympathy or the visible discomfort that some men showed when confronted with the specific texture of a woman's difficult life. He just listened. Then he told her that he had grown up in Colorado, on a homestead that had broken his parents by the time he was 17, too much land for too few hands, too many bad seasons in a row. His father had sold the land and moved his mother to Denver, and Roy had stayed west, hiring on with various cattle operations throughout his 20s until he had saved enough to file his own claim on the Northeast Corridor land in 1891. He had built the house himself, mostly, with help from 2 neighboring ranch families. He was, he told her, 30 years old. She was 22. She noticed that he did not seem to think the arithmetic was anybody's problem but the 2 people involved. "What made you stay?" she asked. "In Redemption Falls, I mean. You could have established anywhere." He thought about it, which she liked. He actually thought before he answered rather than giving her the first available response. "The land there," he said, "in the Northeast Corridor where my place is, the way it looks in the morning right at dawn when the light comes off the Silver Hills. There was something about it that felt like a place I could be." He paused. "I know that sounds like a small reason." "No," she said. "It sounds like an honest one." He looked at her across the table with something in his expression she didn't have a name for yet. She had a name for it 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks, Roy Ralston came to town 4 times, which was more than he had previously managed in any given month, and each time he came to the hotel for supper, and each time they talked, and the conversations built on each other the way conversations do when both people are paying attention. He told her about the ranch, the cattle, a small apple orchard he had planted on the south-facing slope, because someone had told him apples would grow there, and he had decided to find out. The horses he ran, a small herd with good bloodlines that he was building up slowly. She told him about the books she had read, and he turned out to have read a surprising number of them, though his reading had been done in the kind of fragmented, catch-as-catch-can way of a man who had done most of his living outdoors. Novels picked up second-hand in trading posts, histories borrowed from other ranchers, almanacs studied for practical reasons that became genuine interest. He listened to her opinions. Not politely, in the way men sometimes nod at women's opinions while waiting for the subject to change, but with the focused alertness of someone who is genuinely interested in what the other person has concluded and why. She noticed this most clearly the afternoon he asked her what she thought about the ongoing arguments in the territory about land grants and water rights, a subject that was politically complicated and emotionally charged in the West of 1893, and she gave him her honest assessment, and he pushed back on one point, not to dismiss her, but to actually debate it. And they argued pleasantly, and with growing enthusiasm for 20 minutes, and she felt more fully herself in those 20 minutes than she had in years. When Voss finally rode out of Redemption Falls in the second week of October, having apparently concluded that his legal strategy was not going to produce the results he needed, and that the town's marshal was not the pliable sort, there was a general atmosphere of relief that expressed itself in the Western way. Nobody said much, but the temperature of the place dropped about 20 degrees, in the good direction. Roy told Frances the news across the hotel desk, and she let out a breath she had been holding for a month. "He'll find somewhere else to be unpleasant," she said. "Probably," Roy agreed. "There's always somewhere for men like that." He was quiet for a moment. They were alone in the lobby, Mabel having gone to the storeroom, and the afternoon light was coming through the windows in long amber bars. Roy Ralston was looking at her with the expression she had finally found a name for, which was something between tenderness and determination, and she understood that he was gathering himself to say something. "Frances," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it carefully, like something he had been saving up, made her heart do something inconvenient in her chest. "I'd like to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer is entirely yours to give, and that whatever you say I won't do what men do, which is take no for a difficulty and yes for an obligation. I want you to understand that I'm asking because I genuinely want to know what you want." She was completely still. She was looking at him and he was looking at her, and the amber light lay across the floor between them. "I'd like to court you properly," he said. "If that's something you want. Not something you feel obligated toward, not something because it makes practical sense, but because you want it." He stopped and added, with the honesty that she had come to understand was simply his nature, "I find I think about you considerably more than makes sense for a man with a ranch to run, and I think you're the most interesting person I've met in this territory, and I would very much like the chance to know you better, if you want that." Frances Prescott stood behind the front desk of the Grand Hotel in Redemption Falls, New Mexico Territory, on an October afternoon in 1893, and she felt the question land on her like light, warm and real, and full of the specific quality of something freely offered. Not an arrangement, not a convenience, not the outcome of someone else's negotiations. A question addressed to her about what she wanted. "I do want that," she said. "I would like that very much." He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his whole face in a way that made her understand why she had been cataloging the near smiles so carefully. This was what they had been practiced for. The courtship of Frances Prescott and Roy Ralston proceeded through October and November of 1893, in the way things proceed in small Western towns, with everybody watching and nobody quite admitting to it. Mabel Garrett watched with unconcealed approval. Horace Beale at the general store inquired after Roy's health, every time Francis came in for the hotel's supplies, which was his way of asking how things were going. The Reverend Aldridge gave Roy a particularly firm handshake one Sunday morning, which Roy accepted with equanimity. Roy came to town on Saturdays when the ranch work allowed, and on Wednesdays occasionally. And sometimes they walked in the evening along the main street, and sometimes they sat on the hotel's porch in the cooler evenings that came as the season turned. He asked her questions about herself with the specific quality of a man who is constructing a portrait with great care, not the rapid-fire interrogation of a man filling in a checklist, but the slow, patient curiosity of someone who understands that a person is built in layers, and that each layer has to be offered, not extracted. He asked her one Wednesday evening, sitting on the porch with the stars coming out in the enormous New Mexico sky above them, what she would do if she could do anything. Not what was practical, not what made sense, what she would actually do if she could choose without constraint. Francis thought about it for a long time. The honest answer frightened her a little, not because it was dangerous, but because she had kept it in the most private room of herself for so long that saying it out loud felt like opening a window that had been painted shut. "I would like to have land," she said. "Something of my own. A place I could plant things and build things and look at and know that it was mine. And I would like to keep reading. And I would like to write something, I don't know what exactly, maybe nothing important but something. And I would like to make my own decisions about all of it." The night was very quiet. Roy was looking at the street below the porch, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression was serious in the way that meant he was giving her his full consideration. "Those are good things to want," he said, "all of them." "They probably seem like large things," she said, "for a woman in my circumstances." "They seem like honest things," he said, "and the only circumstances that matter are the ones you choose." She looked at him in the dark. "You really believe that?" "I've been building something for 3 years on land I chose myself," he said. "I know what it feels like to choose. I'd like for you to have that." She understood, sitting there in the October dark, that Roy Ralston was not a man who was going to manage her or arrange her or hand her from one situation to another. She understood it not as a hope, but as a fact, the same kind of fact as the temperature of the air or the distance to the horizon. He was a man who saw her as a person with the full rights of personhood, and in a world that had consistently treated her otherwise, this was, she realized, the most extraordinary thing she had ever been offered. She reached across the space between the porch chairs and set her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers, gently, the way you hold something valuable. They stayed like that for a long time, watching the stars move, and said very little, because very little needed to be said. November came cold and clear, and Redemption Falls settled into its winter preparations. Francis continued to run the hotel's accounts and dining room with the efficiency that Mabel had come to rely on so completely that she had given Francis a raise in late October and the authority to handle the supply orders independently. Francis had also, quietly, begun writing in the evenings, not in the journal exactly, but a longer thing, an account of what she had seen and heard in Redemption Falls, a document of the town's particular life that she was not sure would ever be anything more than words in a notebook, but that she found she needed to produce nevertheless. She showed Roy a few pages one Saturday afternoon, sitting in the hotel's small sitting room, and he read them carefully and then looked up and said, "You write like you think, clear and direct, no unnecessary ornamentation." Then, after a beat, "That's a compliment." "I know," she said, and he laughed, and it occurred to her that she made him laugh fairly often and that this was one of her favorite things. He proposed to her in December, on the Saturday before Christmas, in the sitting room of the Grand Hotel with the snow coming down outside the windows in the first good snowfall of the season. He did not kneel, which she later told Mabel she was glad of, because kneeling felt performative and Roy was not a performative man. He sat across from her, and he said that he had been thinking about how to do this properly, how to ask in a way that was genuinely asking and not in any way telling, and that he had decided the only way to do that was to say exactly what he was thinking. What he was thinking was this: he loved her. He had been watching himself arrive at this fact for several weeks with the pleased astonishment of a man who had not known he was looking for something until he found it. He thought she was remarkable in the particular way that word actually means: worthy of remark, worth noticing, worth the effort of full attention. He wanted to marry her if she wanted to marry him, and if she did, he wanted her to understand what that would look like. What it would look like, he said, was this: the ranch would be both of theirs, not his with her living in it. She could plant what she wanted to plant and build what she wanted to build. She would keep her own money and manage her own time. He would not make decisions that affected her life without talking to her first. He was not under the impression that he was better equipped to run her existence than she was. He just wanted to be in her life, and to have her in his, and to build something together that belonged equally to both of them. Frances sat across from Roy Ralston in the small hotel sitting room, with the snow coming down outside and tears on her face that she did not bother to wipe away, because the only other person in the room was the one person she did not need to perform composure for. "Yes," she said, "I want to marry you. Yes." She did not marry him the first available Thursday. She married Roy Ralston on the first clear Saturday in February of 1894, which she chose herself, on the date she chose herself, in the dress she chose herself. Not a gray dress this time, but a deep blue-green one that Mabel Garrett helped her make from fabric Frances had selected at Horace Beale's store, the color of river water when the sun is fully on it. The ceremony was held in Reverend Aldridge's small church and attended by what seemed like the majority of the town of Redemption Falls, which was not something Frances had anticipated, but which she found she didn't mind. Mabel sat in the front row and cried in a forthright, unapologetic manner. Roy stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and is aware that he is correct in this assessment. When the Reverend asked the questions, Frances Prescott said yes, and meant it from a place so deep and certain that it felt like bedrock. They rode out to the ranch that evening, Roy on his gray horse and Frances on the chestnut mare that Roy had quietly purchased 3 weeks earlier and not mentioned until the morning of the wedding, when he had brought her to the livery stable and said that she ought to have a horse that was hers, with papers in her name. She had looked at the mare for a long moment, and then at Roy, and then back at the mare, and had said, in a voice that was doing considerable work to stay level, "She's beautiful." The mare had turned her head and looked at Frances with the patient brown eyes of a horse who already knew she was beautiful and was not surprised to be told. The ranch was 12 miles northeast of town, and they reached it in the cold blue dark of the February evening. Roy had lit the lamps before riding to town that morning, so the house came out of the dark with light in its windows, and Frances saw it properly for the first time, a solid, well-built structure of timber and adobe, not grand but substantial, with a covered porch along the front and a pair of cottonwood trees on the east side that in the summer, Roy had told her, would give shade in the afternoon. He helped her down from the mare, which she did not need but accepted because the gesture was genuine, and then he opened the door and she walked in. The house was, she searched for the right word, and then simply accepted the accurate one, warm. It had the warmth of a house that was well built and well kept, with a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall and wooden floors that had been scrubbed. There was a kitchen with a good stove and a solid table and 4 chairs. There were shelves on the wall of the main room, and on those shelves, Roy had placed her books. He had gone to the hotel the week before and with Mabel's help had collected them from Frances's room and arranged them here, not in any order she recognized, but in a careful, considered arrangement that suggested he had thought about it. Frances stood in front of the bookshelves and looked at her books on Roy Ralston's shelves and understood that they were on her shelves now too in her house, on land that was hers as much as anyone's, and the feeling that came over her was not dramatic. It was very quiet and very complete, the feeling of arriving somewhere you had been trying to get to for a very long time. She turned around and Roy was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her. "There's room for more," he said. "The shelves." "I noticed," she said. "I thought you'd want space to grow your library." "I do," she said. "Thank you," she paused, "for all of it." For she stopped, because the inventory of the things she was grateful for was too long and too specific, and she wasn't sure language was adequate to it. "I know," he said quietly, and she thought that he probably did. She crossed the room and he held out his hand and she took it, and they stood in the warm room with the fire burning and the New Mexico winter pressing against the windows and the whole of the future an open country ahead of them. The spring of 1894 was the first spring Frances Prescott had ever experienced as her own. She made a kitchen garden that was considerably more ambitious than the one at Dry Wash Flats. She put in tomatoes and beans, and 3 kinds of squash, and a row of sunflowers along the south fence because she wanted them, just because she wanted them, which was a reason she was learning to accept as fully valid. Roy helped her turn the soil on a Saturday morning and they worked side by side in the warming air, and she thought that this, the simple fact of working alongside someone rather than for them, was one of the most underrated pleasures in the world. She also continued to write. Roy had found her a proper writing desk at an auction in the county seat and carried it home in the wagon and installed it in the corner of the main room with a lamp beside it. And she wrote there in the evenings while Roy read, the two of them occupying the same space in the companionable silence of people who are comfortable with each other's presence. She was writing what she now understood to be a kind of history. A chronicle of redemption falls in its particular moment, with the particular people who were making it. She interviewed Mabel Garrett on Saturday visits to town. She interviewed Horace Beale about the changes in goods and prices over the decade. She spoke to some of the Mexican families who had been in the territory for generations, before the Anglo wave of settlement had arrived to redraw the boundaries of belonging, and she wrote their stories too, with the understanding that the history of this place was not only the history of the people who had most recently arrived with the most money and the loudest voices. Roy read what she wrote and offered his thoughts with the honest engagement of a man who respected what she was doing without trying to direct it. He pointed out once that she had gotten a date wrong on a particular land dispute, and she corrected it, and then he pointed out that her account of the dispute itself was more accurate than anything the Redemption Falls Gazette had printed, which was true, and which she accepted with some satisfaction. The summer of 1894 brought heat and growth in equal measure. The garden produced abundantly, and Frances found herself supplying tomatoes and beans to several of the town families in exchange for various goods and services, which was a small economy she had created and was running entirely herself, and the pleasure of this was out of proportion to its size. She had planted a rose bush against the south wall of the house that Roy had told her probably would not take, and it had taken, was putting out small brave red blossoms by July, and she felt unreasonably vindicated. Roy was expanding the cattle operation, purchasing additional stock from a rancher 2 valleys over who was aging out of the business, and the work of the ranch intensified through the summer months. There were hired hands, 2 permanent ones, a Mexican man named Aurelio who had been with Roy since the beginning and knew the land as well as Roy did, and a young man named Pete who had drifted in from Arizona the previous year and stayed because, as he told Frances once, the food was good and the work was fair, which she thought was a perfectly reasonable basis for loyalty. There were other hands during the busy season, men who came and went with the cattle work. Frances participated in the ranch decisions not as a silent partner but as an equal voice. Roy brought the account books to the table in the evenings, and they went through them together. When a question arose about whether to invest in additional fencing on the east boundary or hold the money against a potentially dry summer, They discussed it from both angles and arrived at a conclusion that drew on both their perspectives. It was, Frances thought, what it was supposed to be like: two people thinking together, making things together, neither one managing the other. She was happy. The word seemed insufficient, the way single words are always insufficient for large and complex states, but it was accurate. She was happy in a way she had not previously known was available to her, not the happiness of relief or the happiness of having avoided something worse, but the deep, quiet, ordinary happiness of a life that was genuinely hers. She was also, by October of 1894, fairly certain she was expecting a child. She told Roy on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them. She told him directly because that was the only way she knew how to say important things, and she watched his face go through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something very close to joy, and then a careful attentiveness that made her understand he was asking silently how she felt about it. "I'm all right," she said. "I am more than all right. I'm glad. I want this." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and his eyes were bright in the lamplight. "I'm glad, too," he said. Yes, I'm very glad. You might want to be less understated about it," she said. He laughed, that full laugh that still did something pleasant to her chest. "I am very, extraordinarily glad," he said. "I am possibly the most glad person in the New Mexico Territory at this exact moment." "That's better," she said. She went into the winter of 1894 with the expanding certainty of the child and the work of the ranch and the writing and the garden put to bed under its winter mulch, and she felt the season as something rich and anticipatory. Roy was careful with her in all the right ways, not in the hovering, anxious way that removed her agency, but in the way of a man who paid attention and adjusted himself accordingly. He took on the heavier of the outdoor tasks that she would usually have joined him in. He made sure the house was warm. He rode to town on a Tuesday to speak with the doctor, a new man named Dr. Sheridan, who had set up practice in Redemption Falls the previous spring, and came back with information about what to expect and when to summon the doctor and what warning signs to watch for, all of which he conveyed to Frances in full, because she was an adult woman with the right to know the facts of her own body and her own situation. Mabel Garrett drove out to the ranch every 2 weeks through the winter, which she said was purely social, and which everyone understood was a form of supervision that Mabel felt was her right, and that Frances was genuinely glad of. Mabel brought food and opinions and stories from town, and sat at Frances's kitchen table and drank coffee, and talked with the particular vitality of a woman who has made herself entirely necessary, which was accurate. The baby was born in May of 1895, on a morning when the apple trees on the south-facing slope were in full bloom, and the smell of blossom was in every room of the house. It was a boy, and he came into the world with the maximum amount of fuss and a head of dark hair, and he was placed in Frances's arms by Mabel Garrett, who had been present for the delivery along with Dr. Sheridan, and Frances looked down at him and felt the full weight of the moment, the specific, staggering love of it, and also the thought that this boy would not be passed anywhere. He would be hers. He would be Roy's. He would grow up in a house where his mother had chosen to be and chosen to stay, and he would understand, when he was old enough to understand, what that meant. Roy came in from the front room, where Mabel had banished him in the early hours with the firm authority of a woman managing a necessary situation, and he stood beside the bed and looked at the baby and then at Frances, and his face was the most open she had ever seen it, all the careful, quiet containment he carried around himself simply gone, replaced with something raw and unguarded. "He's remarkable," Roy said, his voice thick. "He is," Frances agreed. "The only word for it." "What should we call him?" They had discussed names but had not settled. Frances looked at the baby, who had stopped fussing and was regarding the ceiling with the focused concentration of someone encountering existence for the first time and finding it worth examining. "James," she said. "James Thomas Ralston." She paused. "Thomas was my father's name. He wasn't a particularly good father, but I think the name deserves a better association." Roy was quiet for a moment. "James Thomas Ralston," he said, trying it out. "I like that." "You can have a say," she said. "I'm being magnanimous. You could propose an alternative." "No," he said. "James Thomas Ralston is exactly right." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in her arms, and she leaned slightly into the warmth of him beside her. "He's going to need a garden to dig in," Roy said. "He will absolutely have one," Frances said. "And a horse when he's old enough. Obviously. And a great many books. Goes without saying." Roy looked at her, and in his expression was everything she had named and a few things she still did not have the right language for but recognized by their weight. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, just for her. "I am very well," she said, and it was true in the largest possible sense of the word. Mabel Garrett left at midday, having declared the situation satisfactory on all fronts, and Frances and Roy spent the afternoon in the quiet of the house with James Thomas Ralston, who slept in the cradle that Roy had built over the winter from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth enough to put your cheek against. The apple blossoms moved outside the window in the warm May air, and the ranch was quiet the way it always was in the middle of the day, and Frances lay in the bed, with her husband sitting in the chair beside her and their son asleep in the cradle, and felt the completeness of it settle over her like something she had been waiting for without knowing it. She had been passed from hand to hand, room to room, arrangement to arrangement, since she was 6 years old, and she had arrived here, not because someone had delivered her, but because she had refused Clement Alderman's plan and gotten on the stage north and landed in Redemption Falls with $43, and the stubborn conviction that she was a person capable of making her own decisions. Roy Ralston had not rescued her. What he had done was rarer and more difficult. He had looked at her and seen someone who deserved to be asked what she wanted, and then he had asked, and then he had listened to the answer. The years that followed were full and varied in the way of years that are genuinely lived. The summer of 1896 brought a drought that tested everyone in the Northeast Corridor and required hard decisions about the cattle numbers and the water rights. And Frances and Roy made those decisions together at the kitchen table with the account books and the almanacs, and the honest acknowledgement that they could not control the weather but could manage its consequences with intelligence and care. They got through it. The ranch survived leaner than it had gone in, but intact, which was more than some of their neighbors managed. The writing project had by 1896 become a manuscript of significant length, a genuine chronicle of Redemption Falls and the surrounding territory, with particular attention to the stories that were in danger of being lost. The families who had been there before the wave of Anglo settlement, the women who had built the domestic and social infrastructure of the town, while the men's names went on the business fronts. The Mexican workers whose labor had made the cattle operations viable, and whose wages and working conditions were a subject of ongoing injustice, that Frances documented with careful precision, and without excessive editorializing, because she believed facts were more powerful than rhetoric when properly assembled. She showed the manuscript to Roy in the summer of 1896, all of it, and he read it over 3 evenings with the focused attention he gave to anything that mattered to him. When he finished, he said, "You should find someone to print this. It might cause some trouble," she said. "Some of the people in it are still alive and still powerful." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." She submitted the manuscript to a publisher in Santa Fe the following spring, through a connection Mabel Garrett had with a woman in the city who was involved in the territory's small but growing literary community. The response came back in the fall of 1897. They would publish it in a limited edition as a territorial history. It was not a transformation of Frances's circumstances or a great moment of public recognition, because the world in which she moved in 1897 was not one that made space for female chroniclers to become famous. But the book was printed. Copies reached Redemption Falls and the surrounding towns. People she had written about read what she had written, and told her that she had gotten it right, which was its own form of completion. The copy she was most pleased with was the one she placed on the shelf in the main room of the ranch house, between a cattle almanac and a novel by Thomas Hardy. Roy had set a small carved wooden bookend beside it, which he had made himself over the winter, a piece that looked like nothing she could specifically name, but that had the quality of something made with care, which was the only style he worked in. In the spring of 1897, Frances Prescott Ralston also discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Roy at the breakfast table on a Wednesday morning over coffee, with the matter-of-fact directness that was their shared language, and he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and looked at her with the open, unguarded expression that still undid her every time she saw it, 3 years into their marriage. "2," he said. "Arithmetic, yes," she said. "James is going to have opinions about this." "James has opinions about everything," Frances said. "He's 2 years old." "It's practically his vocation," Roy laughed. "He gets that from you," he said. "He gets it from excellent example," she said. Their daughter was born in December of 1897, in the room where James had been born, with the same participants, Dr. Sheridan, Mabel Garrett, and Roy in the front room until Mabel declared him welcome. She was smaller than James had been and calmer from the very first moment, looking up at Frances with gray-green eyes that were clearly going to be the river-water eyes Frances had inherited from someone she had never known, and Frances named her Clara after her mother. Clara May Ralston arrived in a year that was otherwise notable for territorial politics and silver price fluctuations, and she was far and away the most interesting thing that happened in it. Mabel Garrett held Clara with the practiced ease of a woman who had held a great many babies and had opinions about all of them, and declared her satisfactory in a voice thick with affection. James, who had been brought out from town by Aurelio's wife Rosa for the purpose, examined his sister with the careful curiosity of a nearly 3-year-old, and then announced that she was very small and could she ride a horse yet, which established his relationship with Clara on terms that continued throughout their shared childhood. The years built themselves one on another the way years do when the life is good, not without difficulty, because there was no life without difficulty on the New Mexico frontier in the late 1890s and early 1900s, but with the steadiness of a foundation that had been built correctly. The drought of 1899 was harder than the one in 1896 and required the sale of a portion of the cattle herd to see them through. Roy's gray horse died in the autumn of 1900, which was a grief of the particular kind that comes from losing an animal you have moved through important years alongside, and Frances sat with him in the barn that evening and said nothing that needed to be said because her presence was what the moment required and she knew it. They purchased 2 new horses in the spring of 1901, and Roy named his without ceremony and Frances named hers with considerable deliberation, settling finally on June, because she was the color of the afternoon in that month. Redemption Falls grew and changed. The silver in the hills to the northeast played out by 1899, and several of the families who had come for the mining left, and the town contracted somewhat, and then restabilized around the cattle economy, which was more permanent. A school was established in 1900, a proper one with a hired schoolteacher from back east named Miss Margaret Hollies, who was young and capable and full of pedagogical convictions, and James Ralston enrolled in the fall of 1901 at 6 years old, and came home the first day with the expression of someone whose mind has been introduced to new food and is still processing the implications. Frances served on the school board from its establishment, which was not a given since women's participation in civic bodies in the New Mexico Territory in 1900 was a subject of considerable dispute. She attended the first organizational meeting, sat down at the table, and participated in the discussion with the calm authority of someone who had done her reading on the subject and had opinions worth hearing. And the men at the table, most of whom she knew and some of whom she had interviewed for her book, found it practically difficult to object, because Frances Prescott Ralston had the particular quality of being impossible to dismiss without making yourself look foolish. And they were not all foolish men. Roy had told her before the meeting that she had his full support in whatever she decided to do about the school board, and she had thanked him and said she intended to act on that, and he had said good, and they had not belabored it further because it did not require belabouring. There was a moment in the winter of 1901, a quiet Tuesday evening after the children were in bed and the house was warm around them, and the wind was moving through the cottonwood trees outside, when Frances looked up from her writing and across the room to where Roy was mending a piece of harness with the absorbed, unhurried attention he brought to physical work, and she felt the whole of it at once, not like a revelation, because it had been building for years, but like the moment you recognize a landscape you have been walking through for a long time and understand fully, for the first time, where you are. She was in her own life, not someone else's plan for her life. Not the life that had been arranged around her while she stood in the middle of it like furniture. Her own, chosen, built from the ground-up life, with her husband across the room and her children in their beds, and her book on the shelf and her garden dormant under the snow outside and her mare in the barn and her name on the deed of the land she was sitting on. Roy looked up from the harness and found her looking at him, and the question in his expression was quiet and genuine. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said, and went back to the harness, and she went back to her writing, and the wind moved through the cottonwood trees and the lamp burned. She would remember that moment, specifically and precisely, for the rest of her life. In 1903, Frances wrote a second book shorter than the first, more personal in its form, a collection of accounts by women in the New Mexico Territory about their lives, their work, their choices and the absence of choices and the presence of them. She gathered the material over 18 months of correspondence and 2 trips by wagon to neighboring towns, and she wrote it with the same clear, direct prose that had made the first one worth reading. It was published in Santa Fe in 1904 and attracted a modest attention in the territory and a somewhat larger attention in certain circles back east, where the question of women's lives and women's rights was a subject of growing urgency. She received 3 letters from women she had never met who wrote to tell her that the book had said something they had not been able to say themselves, and she treasured those letters in a way she could not fully account for except to understand that this was what writing was for. Roy read the second book the week it arrived from the printer and said that it was the better of the 2, which she had suspected, and which it meant something to have confirmed. He said it at the kitchen table plainly, without preamble, in the way he said things that he had thought about and was certain of, and then he asked her what she was going to write next. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to find out what I think next." "Take your time," he said. "I'll keep the coffee on." James was 9 years old in 1904, a long-legged, serious-faced boy who was already, in the manner of ranch children, considerably more capable than his years would suggest. He could ride well and help with the lighter cattle work, and had taken to reading with the focused avidity that Frances recognized from her own childhood. He had also, it turned out, a gift for mathematics that went beyond the practical. He worked through problems for the pleasure of it, which both his parents found interesting and slightly baffling and entirely wonderful. Clara at 6 was a different creature, entirely quicker to laugh than James, with her mother's eyes and her father's way of paying attention, and a determination about her own preferences that was expressed with a cheerful absoluteness that made Frances think, frequently, of herself at that age, and feel something between amusement and profound recognition. Clara planted her own section of the kitchen garden in the spring of 1904, a small plot that Roy helped her stake and turn, and she grew tomatoes, and one extremely ambitious pumpkin that eventually attained a size that impressed even Aurelio, who had seen 30 seasons of growing things and had standards. She called the pumpkin Gerald, for no reason anyone could determine, and defended it against all criticism with the calm certainty of someone who has the primary facts on her side. There were, in those years, a number of occasions on which Frances understood the distance she had traveled from the girl who had stood in Millhaven's dry goods store sweeping floors. Not always in the dramatic moments, not only in the publishing of books or the school board meetings or the moments of particular happiness, sometimes in very small things, in the way she spoke to the hired hands about the work and they spoke back to her with the respect of people addressing someone with authority that had been earned. In the way she could walk into the general store in Redemption Falls and be greeted by Horace Beale's daughter, who had taken over the store from her aging father, as Mrs. Ralston, which was her name and her place in this community. In the way she could sit on the porch of her own house in the evening and watch the hills turn gold in the setting sun and think of nothing in particular, just exist in the warmth of the air and the solidity of the boards under her and the sound of Roy and the children in the house behind her, and feel that just this, exactly this was enough. In 1906, Mabel Garrett came down with a serious illness in the late winter, the kind that the doctor called inflammation of the lungs, and that the town understood as the sort of thing you watched carefully because it could go either way. Frances drove into Redemption Falls on every clear day for 3 weeks and sat with Mabel in the hotel that Mabel had been running for 20 years, and she brought food and company, and the particular form of stubborn, practical help that Mabel herself had modeled. She read to Mabel from the books they both liked, and she managed the hotel's accounts during those weeks, which Mabel would deny needing but which Mabel clearly needed. Mabel recovered. She sat up in bed on a March morning and announced that she was not going to be carried off by inflamed lungs, which everyone in the room, including Dr. Sheridan, received with considerable relief. By April she was back behind the front desk of the Grand Hotel, thinner than before but entirely herself, and Frances sat across from her at the small table in the lobby with coffee between them and felt the particular gratitude of having not lost something you needed. "You saved my hotel," Mabel said. "You were going to recover regardless," Frances said. "The hotel, Frances. The accounts were a disaster before you came." "They really were," Frances agreed. Mabel looked at her with the sharp, fond eyes that had been the first pair to look at Frances Prescott in this town and see what was actually there. "You've done well for yourself," Mabel said. "Better than well." "I've had good circumstances," Frances said. "You've had a good man and a good mind and you've made the most of both," Mabel said, with the directness of a woman who had earned the right to plain speaking. "Don't undervalue your own part in it." Frances thought about this on the drive home that afternoon, with the April light laying long and golden over the territory, and the road good under the wagon wheels and the hills to the northeast, catching the light on their silver-striped slopes. She thought about Millhaven and Harold Prescott, and the Wentworths and Gerald Alderman and Clement Alderman and the stage north, and the $43 and Roy Ralston's face across the hotel dining room table. She thought about the question he had asked her, the question that was still, in some ways, the most important question anyone had ever asked her. "What do you want?" She thought about what she had wanted and what she had gotten, and the degree to which those two things overlapped, and found that the overlap was very nearly complete. Roy was in the yard when she pulled up to the ranch, helping Aurelio with something near the barn, and he came across the yard to take the horses' heads while she climbed down, and he looked at her with the attentiveness that was, after 12 years, still the same quality of looking, not dulled by familiarity but deepened by it, the way a known landscape shows you more the longer you look at it. "How is Mabel?" he asked. "Mabel is Mabel," Frances said. "Which is to say, completely recovered and considerably relieved about it." Roy smiled. "Good," he said. He kept her hand as she came down from the wagon and she let him, and they walked across the yard together. "Children have been reasonably civilized," he reported. "James finished his arithmetic work. Clara has harvested several entirely theoretical arguments with the bunkhouse cat. Did the cat win?" "The cat always wins," Roy said. "Clara considers this a temporary setback." The spring moved into summer and the summer into the cooler, brilliant autumn, and the years continued their patient accumulation. James turned 14 in 1909 and had by then a clearer sense of the ranch work than some grown men Francis had known, and a patience for the cattle that came from genuine interest in animals rather than obligation. Clara at 11 was already talking about what she was going to do when she was grown up, and the list was various and changed by the season. She had been going to be a doctor, and then a school teacher, and then a horse breeder, and then had spent 2 months fixed on the idea of becoming a cartographer, which she said because she had found the word in a book and liked the sound of it. Francis encouraged all of it, understanding that the point was not the specific vocation, but the fact of its being chosen. They had one more child, a second son born in the autumn of 1910. They named him William after Roy's father, Will Ralston, who had died the previous winter in Denver. William arrived in the same room as the others, on a crisp October day, and he was from the beginning a cheerful, round-faced child who smiled early and often, and seemed constitutionally disposed toward contentment, which James told his parents was probably a useful trait for the youngest of 3. Roy was 47 years old when William was born, and Francis was 39, and Roy held his youngest son in the rocking chair by the fireplace that evening with the careful joy of a man who understands exactly how good the thing is that he is holding, and Francis, watching him from the bed where she was recovering, felt the fullness of her life settle around her with the weight of something permanent. This, she thought, had been the shape of it all along. She had simply needed to get far enough in to see it. The second decade of the 20th century brought changes to the territory and to the nation that would eventually change everything. New Mexico became a state in 1912, and Frances was in Redemption Falls the day the news came through, and she stood in the street with the rest of the town, while the news passed from person to person, and felt the particular significance of it, the way she always felt the particular significance of things that rearranged the categories. The state's constitution, unlike those of many others, allowed women to hold certain public offices, which was a subject Frances had opinions on and expressed through 3 letters to the new state legislature that she was fairly certain were read, and that she believed, on general principle, were worth writing regardless of immediate outcome. The school in Redemption Falls had expanded by 1912 to a proper 2-room building with 2 teachers, and James Ralston, 17 years old and of the opinion that he knew what he wanted, announced that summer that he intended to study engineering, possibly in Albuquerque or possibly further east, and he said it the way his mother had taught him to say important things, directly and with certainty and without apology. Frances and Roy sat at the kitchen table with him and talked it through, and both of them told him that they supported it, and Frances told him specifically that he should go as far as he needed to go and come back when he was done with whatever the world needed to teach him, and that the ranch would be here. He left in the fall of 1913, on the train from a town 40 miles south that had a proper depot, and Frances stood on the platform and watched the train go and felt the specific grief of a necessary good thing, which is its own distinct variety of feeling. Clara at 16 was preparing for her own next thing with characteristic determination. She had settled, by 1913, on veterinary medicine, which was an unusual ambition for a woman of that era and entirely consistent with everything Frances knew about her daughter. She had been studying Roy's veterinary manuals with focused intensity for 2 years and assisting Dr. Hayes, the ranch's large animal veterinarian, during his visits with a seriousness that had earned his respect, and eventually, his willingness to explain things to her properly rather than in the simplified version he used for ranch hands who had limited interest. Roy told Clara that her plan was a good one on a Thursday evening in October of 1913, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, and he said it with the same directness and lack of qualification with which he said everything true. Clara looked at her father across the table with the expression of someone who had been prepared for resistance and was recalibrating and said, "You don't think it's too ambitious?" "I think it's ambitious," Roy said. "I don't see that as a problem." Clara looked at her mother. "I've never seen ambition as a flaw in a woman," Frances said, "or in anyone." Clara was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled, the broad, quick smile that was entirely her own. "All right," she said. "Good." Frances looked across the table at Roy, and Roy looked back at her, and there was, in that exchange, the whole of their shared understanding of the children they were raising, and the way they were raising them, and the life they had built together in this house on this land. It was a look that contained all the years, compressed and luminous, the way a long walk looks compressed from the top of a hill. Little Will, 3 years old, chose this moment to announce from the floor, where he had been systematically investigating the properties of his wooden horse, that the horse was now broken, which it was, and which required Roy to excuse himself and conduct a repair, and which made Frances laugh in the sudden, real way she laughed at things that were genuinely funny, and which made Clara laugh too, and the kitchen was full of the sound of it. And the evening outside was turning blue, and the lamps were lit inside, and Roy was on the floor with the wooden horse, saying something to Will in the patient, quiet tone that 3-year-olds required. And this was a Thursday evening at the Ralston ranch, in October of 1913, and it was ordinary and complete in every particular. She had come a very long way from a 6-year-old girl set down at Harold Prescott's door with a carpet-bag, and the assurance that she ate nearly nothing. She had come a long way from the Thursday in March when she had stood in front of a circuit preacher in a borrowed gray dress and said words that had not been asked of her so much as required. She had come through all of it, the quiet years of invisibility, the years of being useful but not seen, the specific exhaustion of being managed, and then the specific courage of refusing to be managed anymore, and she had arrived here. Here was Roy Ralston fixing a wooden horse on the kitchen floor and telling his 3-year-old son that it was going to be fine. It just needed a proper look, which was what he always said about broken things. Here was Clara at the table with her veterinary manual, already back to reading. Here was the sound of the cottonwood trees outside and the smell of the coffee on the stove and her own name, Frances Ralston, on the deed in the strong box, on the spine of the book on the shelf, on the school board records in the file at the town hall. Here was her life, chosen, built, hers. She picked up her pen and opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, October 16, 1913. Because she had learned long ago that it was worth marking the ordinary days as precisely as the dramatic ones. Then she sat for a moment listening to the sounds of the house around her, and she began to write. Roy finished with the wooden horse and rose from the floor and handed it to Will, who received it with the solemn satisfaction of someone whose property has been restored to working order. Roy crossed the kitchen, paused behind Frances's chair, and set his hand briefly and warmly on her shoulder. The lightest touch, a thing he had done 1,000 times, the particular gesture that meant "I'm here," which was all it needed to mean and more than enough. She reached up and covered his hand with hers for a moment, and then he moved to the stove to check on the coffee, and she went back to her writing, and the evening deepened around them, and the lamps burned warm in every room of the house. And outside the cottonwood trees moved in the autumn air, and the land lay quiet under the enormous western sky, belonging to itself and to them, the way it always had and always would.